So, with this beginning, uh, now that we know the five major ways that Louis made absolutism work, I don't know that he ever laid it out quite this way. This is sort of my gimmick, but I believe it works. Giving and taking power of the Parlement. Uh, Remember, the Parlement is the institutional center of the power of the nobility. And he sort of, Louis the 14th, that is, and his many ministers, advisors, were quite careful in the way they handled this. In some ways, they gave more power to the Parlement, particularly the Parlement of Paris. Isn't that fun to say? Parlement of Paris, the most powerful one in the capital. But in other ways, he continued along the same lines as Henry IV and Richelieu in recognizing that this body of judges and administrators had the ability to get in his way, and he intended not to let them. When he was like, I don't know, 15 or 16 years old, just kind of coming into his own as king, he famously sort of made a speech in front of this body that you see in the painting, in somewhat blurry fashion on the right. And in the middle of the speech, I mean, there were other, I think, phrases of this sort, but he told them, "I intend to rule my own kingdom, gentlemen." Basically saying, you better step out of my way if you think because I'm young that I'm going to, bow sort of to you. Forget it. It's going to be the other way around. And they probably were taken aback and probably, kind of scoffed and thought, yeah, this punk kid. But he was true to his word. This guy had nerves of steel and supreme confidence, along with the ability. One of the things that was done here was to create more nobles, and more nobles in particular who were lawyers slash judges, and appoint them to this body as well as sort of the more traditional nobles. The more traditional nobles we can refer to as our textbook does, princes of the blood, right? Blood meaning that their own lineage, their own right heredity as nobles goes back generations. So they had sort of their blood, great great father was sat in this body as well. Nobles of the robe were usually members either of the lesser nobility, who were kind of raised now as members of this august, respected body, powerful body, or people that came from non-noble backgrounds. uh, this is a conflict we'll trace not just in France but throughout Europe over the centuries. The capitalist classes, the business classes, are coming into their own. So some of the super wealthy, sort of newly wealthy families through trade and banking uh, are sometimes ennobled by Louis XIV and other kings in Europe, and sometimes playing kind of a deliberate chess game as a way to try to check the power of the old nobility, in this case, the princes of the blood. And that's what's happening right here. The nobles of the robe are now kind of put in, and they're more likely to be loyal to the king because they got their positions as nobles of the robe and as members of the Parlement because of the king himself. Whereas the older members, coming from, I mean, sort of older in age, but coming from, generations old, extremely high-ranking noble families, they didn't owe their position at all to Louis XIV or the king or the monarchy. So they were more likely to put up opposition, felt that's kind of their role. In fact, that was maybe the major function of the Parlement, although it served many. And it was supposed to sign off on any kind of policy decision made by the king that would otherwise just become law because the king asserted that it was going to become a law. But this was sort of the one exception, or the one sort of uh, uh, hurdle legislation or a decision would have to make, and that is that the Parlement would have to sign off on it, and that means then they had the right not to, which wouldn't necessarily stop it, but it would hold it up and possibly stop it. And what's happening from Louis's time forward is that, and that's what he expected, didn't always get it, but now he's trying to put his foot down as he realizes what's happening. That if he's telling them now, not in this first appearance, but over time, that your job is to make it look like you're debating policy decisions that I make, and make it look like you're doing it, but in the end, you're just going to rubber stamp whatever I do, like it or not, or I'll make more problems for you. And the nobles of the robe were, of course, seen by the princes of the blood as illegitimate. All right, these guys that came from the oldest noble families, they saw themselves as superior to everybody else. But these nobles of the road, these guys are upstarts. You're not really a noble. You just sort of came from a disgusting merchant family. Nobility, classically, especially in France and Spain, a little bit less in England and other places, but the nobility looked down on anybody that made money by working for it, which is odd to us today because our value system is totally different. We admire people that work hard and are successful because of it, but they didn't. They didn't have to work, right? They just inherited their wealth, and so they looked down on people that weren't nobles like themselves. They're very snobbish this way, and they came from success in business. So, but this was all known by Louis XIV. He's kind of playing these groups off against each other and trying to then, through it, lessen the power of the old nobility, princes of the blood, and keep the nobles of the robe, oftentimes coming from the rising wealthy business middle classes, loyal to himself. The palace at Versailles, we started in the first slide of this unit with it. You can see it in another painting in more expansive fashion. And in real life, it is like that big. It's astonishing. And in fact, it was meant to be primarily intimidating through its size and opulence and beauty, etc. In fact, it has its beauty. Don't get me wrong, but the monarchy had all kinds of other palaces, many in Paris and a bunch all over France. Some of which are probably more beautiful in terms of artistic beauty, aesthetic qualities than Versailles. But that was never the intention. The intention was to intimidate, was to overawe. It was so that subjects, citizens, foreign dignitaries came to on a visit to meet with Louis XIV would look around and say, "Oh my God, this guy must be the most rich and powerful person in the world," right? And kind of go gulp. He's going to be formidable to deal with. Look at this. That was the whole point. This had been a small hunting lodge of his father's that Louis visited himself once he became king, and finally decided, I'm going to make this the seat of power. And so he just started having it built, sort of one wing after another after another. And by 1682, this became the capital or the center of government. But government had previously been done in Paris. This was just outside of Paris. Now it's kind of in the suburbs of Paris, since it's grown over the centuries. But he wanted to move away from the center of power. He was close enough to be, back there, in Paris when he needed to. And I think you can sort of see that this probably comes from his childhood as well, having not felt secure in his own palace in Paris in his bed as a little kid. He's now wary about getting kind of caught there, possibly surrounded by enemies again. So he moves all of the functions of government out to Versailles here, and then some. So this became the center of political power in France at his own behest from 1682, which shows that he already had something close to absolute power. Of course, he did by this time, because he made this decision his own, unilaterally. Everybody else just sort of went along. Versailles itself became the center not just of government decisions, but this whole complicated system of social relations that Louis put into place. It's not clear how much of this was done sort of intentionally as part of a plan ahead of time, or how much of it was ad hoc, maybe a little bit of both. But for sure, once it was in place, Louis XIV and his advisors saw the beauty of the system, at least in terms of their goals. And their goal was, as we know, one of the central goals of centralizing power and absolute power, and that is you must find ways to bring the nobility to heel. And so Louis forced the nobility from all regions of France to live at Versailles or in apartments nearby for large chunks of every year. not all the time, but much of the time. And if they wanted to have any say in what went on, if they didn't want to, fall onto the bad side of the king, and nobody did, then they better be there. So the first reason for this is obvious. The closer they are, the more he can keep them under his watchful eye and keep them from, I don't know, plotting against him. Or not that you could totally control it, but you could sort of control it better that way than if they're, in the south of France, where they're from, hundreds of miles from, the capital. So, but it got much more complicated from here. What he did, and I'm going to read the quote on the screen. These are my own words. I'm putting words in Louis XIV's mouth, and I'm saying it in a very 21st century way to make it much more digestible for you. He didn't say these actual words, but the policy was basically boils down to this, even though I'm simplifying it. So this is would be Louis XIV talking to the nobility, and he didn't even in his own 17th century, monarchical, language. He didn't tell them this anyway. They had to figure this out. So he didn't say this, in any form. But this is what's happening. He's saying to them, in essence, all of you need to live here most of the year. There will be lots of ceremonies and entertainments that, if you attend with proper etiquette, decorum, dress, behavior, etc., you will receive my favor and maybe get to be part of my inner circle. One of the cool people. And while you're doing that, me and the people I really trust, only a few of them, will be making decisions, the important decisions, without you elsewhere. And you'll know it. There's nothing you can do about it. So he got them kind of like in this maze, like rats trying to sort of get to the center, and get the cheese before the other rats. He put them in this situation where they were basically forced to go to balls and banquets and operas and official ceremonies when foreign dignitaries were there. And you had to dress properly, you had to behave properly, you had to have all the right manners and customs. And if you didn't do it the right way, you could lose the king's favor. And nobody wanted to. Uh, Part of it was he understood that these people were, snobbish nobles, very proud of their own position, and they didn't want to be out sort of done by other nobles. We're better than that family over there. How come they're more popular with the king than we are? So he understood that human beings in general, I think true of human nature, are we have status kind of baked into our genes, concerns for status. The people that are as vain as the nobility, maybe extra, so. He puts them in this fishbowl and forces them into these ridiculous competitions, and some of them probably saw it as ridiculous and knew what was happening. That this was a sort of a diversion, keeping them diverted from what's really going on, where the big decisions are taking place. But there's nothing they could do about it. They're kind of like trapped again in this maze, running around. So okay, since I got to entertain myself, we might as well compete socially with all the other nobles that are around here. But some of them probably didn't see it or didn't care. To them, the status was the most important thing. So this was brilliant. It wasn't just Louis XIV. It was his trusted handful of coterie of advisors as well. But this ended up maybe being, I think, the most brilliant stroke, with Louis's own fingerprints on it, in sort of taking absolutism to kind of the next stage and step. And it was vicious, by the way. So there's one story that says that he used to kind of walk around the grounds of Versailles with kind of the inner circle. So look at these people on the right. By the way, the photographs here are from a television show that just got canceled after 3 seasons, called Versailles, which is about Louis XIV and his reign and his family. It's actually excellent in many ways, though it just got canceled. You've probably never heard of it. History TV shows generally aren't as popular as other types. So it's worth watching one or more episodes. Let me warn you, however, that there's a bit of violence in it, but more, I think, appropriate to warn you about is that, and I guess in order to get more viewership, there's quite a bit of disrobing that goes on. in one chamber or another of Versailles. There's lots of activity, right, here. So be careful. There's sex and violence. But nonetheless, it's interesting. I like to sometimes show photographs because it sort of makes it look more real. When we see paintings and statues, it kind of people look like they were never actually alive. So part of the reason I do this, it's actually really, really well done. But so this is a brilliant stroke. One story says that he used to walk around the grounds with his in crowd following him. Let's say it's the people with their opera glasses, whatever they're looking at. I don't remember. Um, and they're following him around. It might have been more than that at times, right? And part of the reason they're doing it is because it's to show off we're the cool people, right? We're the really favored nobles. You guys over there who aren't part of this group and aren't invited, right? You're less than we are. But Louis was ruthless about it. So, as an example, let's say there's a guy walking, sort of in front of them just by chance, who yesterday, a week before, had been part of the inner group. He'd been walking with them, but now he wasn't because he had fallen out of favor with the king for whatever reason. And the king basically expelled him and said, you're not part of the group any longer. He wasn't kicked out of Versailles, but that could happen too. But he's not part of the group. And Louis would sometimes say things like, with a total straight face, total seriousness, say like, "Who is that person? I don't know him." And everyone would probably like, go gulp, because the message, of course, was for the people with him. He knew who the person was in every case, for sure. What he's saying is that could be you. Don't cross me because look what happened to this guy. Yesterday he was right here, right, laughing and joking with us, and now I don't recognize him any longer. So mind your P's and Q's because that could be you the day after tomorrow, and you'll be out. So he played hardball here for sure. His most trusted and most famous minister, one of the four guys that was in on all the decisions all the time, is Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who came from an extremely prominent family outside of Paris, but they weren't nobles. They were, again, one of these wealthy business families. He was extremely well educated, Colbert. His family held important positions and made a fortune, but he rose much higher because Louis XIV appointed him as finance minister. And it's one of the highest positions in any government, the guy who deals with the money. So Colbert was so good at it and so loyal and so favored by Louis that he eventually became more than finance minister. He advised Louis on just about everything. And so was always around, and again, the most trusted. So trusted advisor, confidant, in many ways friend, uh, brilliant finance minister, streamlined the country's finances, kingdom's finances, its taxes, uh, its system of credit, and he put the country on a budget, which sounds pretty basic, but the idea of a budget was something fairly new, meaning we sort of decide how much money, we figure how much money we have, how much is going out, how much is coming in, and so allocate this much for this and this much for that, put this much away for a rainy day, and that hadn't been done, and the finances were a mess when he came in, and he helped to kind of put them straight. Though he didn't entirely succeed, I don't think it's his fault. It's that the task was greater than even the ability of a workaholic genius like he was. The quote from the recent biography already mentioned says, "In Colbert, Louis had one of the ablest ministers in the history of France. The Venetian ambassador reported Colbert that is, introduced an incredible economy in the smallest details of every department he controlled, and went on to call him a man like a rock of steel, capable of indefatigable work," meaning like unending work, sometimes up to 18 hours a day. He probably traveled with a secretary in his carriage who read to him or recorded dictation in pencil. Colbert became so powerful that at times he gave instructions to Louis XIV. That is a little misleading. What the author means is that Louis trusted him so much that sometimes he would just tell Colbert, work up, get a plan for this or whatever. And then Colbert said, okay, here's what you're going to do. I figured out, so we get step A, B, C, D. And Louis just, okay, done. So Louis certainly didn't listen to him because he had to. He listened to him because he knew how capable this guy was. But he was right in the inner sanctum, and he's one of the major reasons, that Louis XIV was able to take absolutism in France to kind of its sort of final, complete stage, where it really, really, really was an absolute monarchy when these guys were done with it. So it was the king, but his most trusted ministers, especially this gentleman here. What about religion? I mentioned that Louis saw the need to bring about uniformity of religion. And this can be seen most stringently or most emphatically in what's known as the Edict of Fontainebleau, or the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which are the same thing, 1685. The whole document was signed in this sort of serious or this dramatic scene, see in the kind of blurry drawing in the upper left, at one of the royal palaces you see in the upper right, Fontainebleau. So it's known as the Edict of Fontainebleau. But this revoked, which means sort of rescinded, the earlier Edict of Nantes, done in 1598 by none other than Henry IV, right, one of the previous sort of absolute kings we talked about briefly. And what the Edict of Nantes had done is offered or granted official legal toleration of Protestants, even though France had always been and still was an officially Catholic country. The Edict of Nantes tried to end the, again, huge religious wars and battles politically and militarily by granting the tolerance to Protestants. So kind of saying, oh, let's all kind of get along. And Louis XIV kind of put up with that, and I guess tried it for a time, and then decided, no way. The only way that we're going to bring religious peace and sort of I'm going to be able to maintain absolute control or achieve absolute control is by getting rid of the religious controversy. And the easiest way to do that is just to clamp down on Protestants and tell them to go. So Protestants were given the choice after the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. You can either convert to Catholicism or get the hell out of the country permanently. Right? Some of them did. Some of them said they were going to, or converted, at least officially, and then started practicing or continued to practice Protestantism in their own homes or secretly. If they got caught, they could be and were imprisoned, exiled, or expelled from the country, or even executed. There actually were some executions here as well. So Louis meant business. He was sort of pulling out all stops to get rid of the Huguenot, the French Protestants or French Calvinist Protestants. So he actually thought that many of them would stay. He offered to pay them to convert to Catholicism, and if they wanted to leave the country instead of converting to Catholicism, he required them to pay a tax to get out. And he was apparently shocked when most of them would rather pay to leave France permanently so they could maintain their Protestant faith than stay in France and actually get money for converting to Catholicism. So this became a huge, of course, issue. A historian who wrote a book about religious conflict during this period says, sorry for the lengthy quote, but this will help us. The Huguenot, the Protestants, proved their loyalty to the crown, the government, during the Fronde. They posed no threat to the French state, and their suppression damaged Louis XIV's military, economic, and international position. So why did he do it? Absolutist ideology, absolutist kind of philosophy or dogma. In terms of the ideology of French absolutism, in which the Catholic worldview provided the dominant cultural reference points, the Huguenot did not fit, but should and could be made to fit, thereby imposing order and making manifest the completeness of Louis XIV's rule. He goes on to say in a passage slightly later in the same book, the legitimacy of the French monarchy was intimately tied to the sacral qualities of the kingship. The French took associated rituals such as the anointment of new kings, very seriously long after other Europeans discounted them as atavistic. Atavistic means kind of dangerously old-fashioned. The connection between religion, monarchy, and political community was summed up in the formula one faith, one law, one king. The major debate between moderates and extremists on this issue during the wars of religion concerned not whether to tolerate long-term religious heterogeneity, which means allowing multiple religions, but how to pursue religious homogeneity, which means one religion, should the state suppress heterodoxy by force or embrace a gradual and less violent path. Both Huguenot, Protestants, and Catholics sought a religiously unified polity. They disagreed on whether it should be Reformed, Protestant, Calvinist, or Catholic. So, with the latter part of that is saying, even the minority Huguenot, if they could have had their way, wouldn't have compromised with the Catholics. They would have imposed, 100%, full-time, official Catholicism on everybody else, and told the Catholics either convert or get out. Of course, they couldn't because they're the minority of 10%, and Catholics made up 90% of the country. And this set off huge further conflict. But in the end, it did kind of solve the problem. So was Louis XIV extremely cruel? Yes, and by our standards, it also violates the principle of religious freedom. But that idea wasn't around really anyway. A little bit, but certainly not here, or not many places in Europe, in the world for that matter. So that's something to come in the future. But Louis can be and is criticized for how harsh this policy actually was, and it was indeed that. However, it did solve the problem. Religious conflict was basically gone once sort of all the dust settled. People sort of took off and left, didn't want to stay or got arrested for staying and continuing to practice the Protestant religion, faith. So, well, who would have been happy with this, as cruel as it was? Well, maybe 90% of the Catholics, 90% of the country, right? They didn't have any love for the Protestants anyway. And it helped to secure greater stability and law and order. The streets had been dangerous for the whole 16th century. Again, you could get caught in the middle of a massacre or a rebellion, even if you were trying to stay out of the conflict, and be killed or family members killed, etc. So there were probably plenty of French people, I would argue the majority for sure, maybe not all Catholics, but many of them were darned glad that Louis XIV came down so harshly on the Huguenot. Now, the only reason I point that out is because it's very easy for us, with the advantage of hindsight and with all of what we know and the way we do things in the 21st century, to look back on this policy and others by Louis XIV and other kings like him during his time period and say, oh my God, what a barbarian, what an evil human being. Well, yeah, if he was doing that now, right, we would be correct to think of him as evil. But keep in mind that this kind of policy, this kind of way of dealing with religious conflict, wasn't outside the norm in Europe or in the world at the time. So I like to then make it clear that the majority of the population probably thought of this as a perfectly reasonable and downright good solution to the problem of religious conflict. On Louis's deathbed, he exclaimed, as sort of a confession, I loved war too much. And he lived and reigned forever. I didn't point it out, but because he became king at such a young age, he reigned for decades. In fact, when he finally died, he was succeeded by his great-great-grandson. I'm not kidding. Louis XIV was on the throne for so long that when he died, the next person in line for the throne was his great-great-grandson. So this guy was one of the longest reigning kings in French history. Maybe the longest, I'm not sure about that. He was involved in a war most of the time, in one war or another, maybe 2/3, if not more, of the years he was king, and at least, king in his own right. And one of the major wars near the end of his life and reign as king was the War of the Spanish Succession. And this gives us a glimpse at what can happen to a country that's not so good when a king's power is not checked, as it says here. Meaning, if a king does acquire absolute power, one person makes most of the decisions, or has 99 or 95% of the power. Nobody, I think, ever has 100% of the power. They have to always sort of go through a few other people, a few other institutions. So absolute doesn't literally mean absolute; it means very close. Uh, but when it's that close to the point where basically the king makes the decisions on his own, uh, uh, what can happen that's bad? Well, if he makes bad decisions, there's nobody there to check him. There's no institutional mechanism to correct for mistakes. In our system, with checks and balances and separation of powers, though it works far from perfectly, it does have mechanisms in it that sort of work against somebody making unilateral decisions. Though of course that still happens too in our society, but not nearly to the degree that it happened in an absolute monarchy. So a good example of a king's power being unchecked in ways that are harmful to the society is the origins of the War of the Spanish Succession. Uh, Louis XIV has had his eye on Spain for a long time. Remember, he wanted territorial and dynastic aggrandizement for a long time, and he'd seen Spain as a possible place for French interests to expand into. Spain, remember, had been an extremely powerful, the most powerful country in the previous century, but it had fallen on harder times. And what he knew that he kept sort of his eye on over the years was that one, the king of Spain around at the time that Louis was king was a sad story of a king because, as mentioned earlier in this unit, Carlos II, King of Spain, Louis's contemporary, was the tragic victim of Habsburg forced intermarriage in their families. And he was racked with all kinds of psychological, mental, and physical ailments that basically incapacitated him. So, more or less, for most of his reign, Carlos II couldn't even function as king. So it brought huge instability to Spain. That Louis had his eye on, none too sympathetically, with the fact that one of his grandchildren was married into the Spanish royal family and had a claim to the throne if, in fact, Carlos II died, which would mean, right, that a member of Louis's family could possibly become king of Spain. And this is what he kind of went for when it finally happened. So, quote from the recent biography of Louis that I've already quoted before, the Spanish succession. Succession means who comes next, right? Who succeeds the previous ruler. The Spanish succession goes to the heart of Louis XIV as a man, a king, and a country. His speech accepting the throne for Philip V, his relative, cited many of the forces governing his life and reign: the rights and obligations of birth, a king's will, nationality, public opinion, the will of God, and the peace of Europe. All contributed to Louis XIV's announcement of his acceptance of Carlos II's decision to leave Louis's grandson his thrones. He had multiple thrones. Not mentioned, but as important as any of them, was his rivalry with the House of Austria, remember the Habsburgs, and his desire for the aggrandizement of the House of France. Well, why was this a bad idea? He made a kind of dramatic decision. He weighed counsel, and some of his advisors, thought twice about this and said, I don't know if we should really do this. Why? It would have brought France sort of more power, especially vis-a-vis its arch rival, the Habsburgs, because it was absolutely obvious that if he tried this, and assented to his grandson becoming king, and it required his assent, it required his agreement. And in that dramatic decision, he came out of the room and announced it, and it was quite fateful indeed, because everybody knew that for this to actually happen, and his relative, to Philip V, to become the long-term king of Spain, he was going to have to win a big war first, because the rest of Europe was not going to take this lying down, because it would make France so powerful it would cause too much power, at least from the perspective of England, the Habsburgs, other countries. So everybody was watching this, and everybody knew, including Louis, that if I sort of give my blessing and put my relative, my grandson, on the throne of Spain, Europe is going to be engulfed in war. And it'd probably be a war that France would be hard pressed to win because the rest of Europe was going to basically gang up on them. And that is what happened. The English got involved in the war big time and won, along with their allies, a series of victories that defeated Louis XIV soundly and brought a lot of misery and suffering to not just Frenchmen, but people throughout Europe. Some of the battlefields were in Bavaria and the Netherlands, etc. So this was a war that shouldn't have happened because Louis XIV, as wise as he was, as gifted as he was, he should have known that we're likely to lose the war and it's going to cause untold amounts of suffering. This may have been his worst decision as king of all, but it's a good example of what can happen when power is absolute and unchecked. We now move across the English Channel to 17th century England, and it can be seen as a successful but violent move to constitutional monarchy. So remember, the Stuart kings, this guy being the first of them, wanted to do the same thing that Louis XIV pulled off successfully, but couldn't do it, partially because they didn't have his ability. The Protestant Reformation, as we already know, is sort of connected to the rise of absolutism in the sense that, as we've already seen in France, it's continuing religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics got in the way of bringing about unity, uniformity, conformity, and stability, law and order. But also there's another issue. The Protestant Reformation, breaking away from the Catholic Church, one country after another, about half of Europe remained Catholic, like France, Spain, etc., and about half of it, like the various Germanys, England, the Scots and others moved to Protestantism permanently. So it divided Europe in half. And again, there were the Age of Religious Wars, the 30 Years' War, already mentioned, dividing Europe into a major sort of war. Not all of it was about religion, but everybody sided with their religious counterparts, except for France, as we know. But there's something else. Before the Protestant Reformation, all kings in Europe were all Catholics, had to reckon with the Pope and the power of the Catholic Church, and it was formidable power. They didn't have an army, but the Pope, had a lot of power because there were so many believers and members of the Catholic Church in every country in Europe. It was the only game in town, so everybody was a Catholic, and people believed if we don't go to church and don't take communion, we're going to go to hell. Which meant that kings had to be extremely careful about sort of landing on the wrong side of the Pope, because he had not so much military power, but cultural power, and a lot of it, much more power than you might think. And because that had been going on for hundreds of years, back to the Middle Ages, that it meant that government was sort of thought of differently in Catholic countries, or in all European countries that were all Catholic before the Reformation, because people got used to, kings got used to, nobles got used to, in a sense, sharing power with the Catholic Church. And not surprisingly, then, a lot of political theory and sort of thinking about government coming sometimes from the Catholic Church, certainly influenced by the Catholic Church, was about government having to conform to reason, meaning that government has to conform to basic ideas of human freedom and sort of equality. Everybody that was a Catholic, a Christian, knew that in their faith's tradition, that God created man in his own image, and that God sort of saw everybody as sort of equal in God's eyes. All of those things had political ramifications. Though that coupled again with the reality that the church had power to some degree that limited the power of kings. In a sense, the Catholic Church and Europe as a whole, there were some exceptions and some major thinkers who were on the other side, but they were the minority, believed that government leaders have to accord with reason, what was called natural law and natural rights eventually, that even kings were not above the law. But once the Reformation happened and half of Europe broke away from the Catholic Church, at least in those parts of Europe, it allowed kings to not have to worry about any other powerful person, the Pope or institution, the Catholic Church, limiting their power. And so the Protestant churches tended to put themselves sort of under the leadership of the kings in Protestant countries in a way that Catholic leaders had never done before. And it even caused some Catholic leaders to say, hey, if they're going to do that in Protestant Austria, in Vienna, then we're going to do that, here in this particular Catholic country. This changed the math, the story entirely. And what you get, at least in majority for the first time, is the idea, right, that comes out in part to be divine right of kings, Bishop Bossuet and others, that the rule of a king, the power of a government, is based on God and based on will, a will to power, not on reason, not on it's rational to conclude that kings must rule, to the benefit of their public, the people, and if they don't do so, the people have a right to sort of change the government. That idea was already around well before John Locke and the American revolutionaries, founders of our country. It goes back to the Middle Ages, but it's basically out the window now because kings can do more of what they want because they don't have the churches in their way. Catholic Church is not in their way any longer once the Protestant Reformation happens, and so now they can say, you know what, I rule in God with God's favor, and it's also just about I want power, right? My will, my will, right? My demand is that I'm the king. Uh, Reason and whether or not I benefit the public, that's not my issue. And a great example of this, of course, is the first Stuart king of England, James I. He succeeded the famous Elizabeth I, another long reigning monarch and one of the great monarchs in European history. And he had difficult shoes to fill here. But the Stuarts, James Stuart, and the other in the line of Stuart kings, we'll see, were Scots, at least half Scottish by blood. Henry VIII, the father of Elizabeth I, I know this gets confusing, had a sister that was married into the Scottish royal family, and James I's mother was also another famous person, Mary, Queen of Scots, who eventually got executed by Elizabeth for treason or plotting against her, which she basically did. But Elizabeth, you might know, died childless. She never married. And so there was a big sort of conflict or controversy about who's going to be the next king. She didn't have a direct heir to the throne. So the movers and shakers in Parliament decided, well, we got to keep it in the family for legitimacy purposes. Okay, let's go to the Scottish royal house because James I has half English blood in him and half Scottish. Close enough, right? He does have a right to, tutor, his name was Henry VIII's last name, blood in him. So we can legitimize him. But he'd grown up in Scotland, and he was the current King of Scotland. And so when he became King of England, he'd already been King of Scotland and remained King of Scotland. But this sort of made things difficult for him from the beginning because the English and the Scottish, up until this moment, have always had a sort of checkered relationship. They're united now, but they don't always get along. And that was much more true even then. So he already kind of had one strike against him before he even got to London, and they put the crown on his head for the first time because he's a Scot. However, when it came to understanding or believing, thinking about what his role was, he was under no illusions. He was extremely confident. And reading from a recent book partly on this subject. According to James, the kings ruled directly by God's authority, accountable only to God. He wrote, in fact, I deny any such contract to be made between the king and the people. He was the sole source of law, was not bound by it. The king is above the law, as both the author and giver of strength thereto. He's not bound thereto, but of his own good will. Reversing the entire medieval tradition, James I declared that kings were the authors and makers of the laws, and not the laws of the king. Meaning the laws don't make the king makes the laws. What pleases the prince, or the king, has the vigor of the law. The prince is free from the law. He can make and unmake his subjects, his people, has the power of raising and casting down, of life and death, judges over all his subjects and in all causes, and yet accountable to none but God only. Now, you're probably, from what you know about European history, you might think you know nothing, but you probably know more than you realize from television, movies, popular culture. You might think, well, that's kind of how it had always been. Uh, that's actually not true. It had been that way in some places, and as I said, sort of there was a minority view in European society, but through the Middle Ages, uh, the idea more of kings have to accord to reason, and they have to that reason says or forces us to conclude that kings have limits. They have to rule under law. They have to rule for the good of their people. It's now only after on the other side, this side of the Protestant Reformation, that you really start to see this become the norm. The kings sort of do what they want because it's their will that they be king. They're not beholden to anybody else, and they're certainly not, they don't have to listen to the dictates of where others say reason should lead. He actually said, I'm God's lieutenant on earth, right? And among other things, this shows that the Stuart kings, starting with this guy, had kind of a lack of political tact. Uh, all the Stuart kings were quite good at offending other people and pissing everybody off. He didn't need to say all these things. He could have just ruled as a divine right sort of leader, asserting his will and not recognizing himself as being under law, and said otherwise, or just kept it quiet. But he actually went as far as to say this, loudly. It's like he's screaming it through a bullhorn or something here. And as a Scottish sort of new king, right, that's just another strike against him right from the get-go. So not surprisingly, he became unpopular quite quickly. He did manage to die of a peaceful death in his sleep, natural causes, though we can't say that for his son who succeeded him. But by the time he passed away, he was already in huge conflict with all kinds of different groups, particularly, most importantly, the English House of Commons, the most important part of Parliament or their legislature. His son, uh, sort of the next wannabe absolutist, Charles I, also made lots of enemies by the same kind of loud statements about his authority. And unlike his father, and sort of more obnoxious than his father, was his complete unwillingness to listen to anybody else. He thought, I'm always right, or everyone's always supposed to listen to me 100% of the time because I'm the king. He had no tolerance for anybody disagreeing with him whatsoever. That kind of person is impossible to deal with, especially when they're a king. How does Parliament fight against a divine right king? So these guys are still, not only saying that they rule because they inherited it, it's their right, but they're using the, God said I could rule. God, wants us to rule. What I'm saying is there was already opposition in Parliament, in the House of Commons, but how could you oppose a divine right king if everybody believes in God and everybody still believes in divine right theory? And it was starting to be questioned, but not enough yet to eliminate divine right theory. So if you're a leader in Parliament and you want to oppose the king, James I, or here now Charles I, if you do so, somebody could say you're violating God's will, God's wishes. How can you argue against and criticize a divine right king? Well, the answer is you can't, at least until the public would accept it. And we're not far away from that, but not there. So what do? You go right beneath him. You cut him off at the knees by going after politically his most powerful subordinates. If it had been France, right, it would have been Colbert. Okay, Louis is a divine right king, but Colbert, he's not even a nobility. And the only person, right, that sort of has God's blessing in that sense is the king. Anyone else is fair game, at least, doesn't have that protecting them. So what they did is, okay, we can't, criticize Charles openly. So let's criticize his most powerful subordinates, the people that he's appointed as advisors into important positions. And sure enough, they try to bring those guys down. So it's a pretty clever route to go. These people were often called overmighty subjects, the advisors, that is, saying these guys are sort of too big for their britches. They think they're so important, and they need to be brought down a peg. In this case, they were. Two of the biggest, maybe the two biggest, were the Earl of Strafford on the left, and William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, on the right. Archbishop of Canterbury is, to this day, was even then, the leading church position in the Church of England, or Anglican Church, it's sometimes called. So this is the leading church official. Remember, England has already broken away from Catholicism, so they have their own Protestant church now, and he's the leader of it. But he was a close advisor and ally of the king, and Earl of Strafford was a major nobleman. They were both kind of put in charge of one and the other categories or wings of a policy called thorough. Charles I had the audacity he had, to tell the Parliament to go home, to dissolve Parliament in 1629, and rule without calling Parliament for another 11 years. So 1629 to 1640, the Parliament did not meet because he sent them packing and didn't call them back deliberately. And he had the legal authority to do it, sort of. There was lots of questions about this, and members of Parliament disagreed, but he got away with it because there was enough loyalty behind him, at least at that point, to do without them. But of course, they were chomping at the bit, chafing and waiting for a chance to strike back and bring themselves sort of back. So they weren't giving up; they were just kind of biding their time, and that is a long time to do that, 11 years. This was known as the personal rule of Charles, right? Because he wasn't ruling alongside of Parliament, which brings us back to one of the main obstacles to absolute power being achieved in England, and that was Parliament. Parliament, for hundreds of years already before this, had recognized rights under law as part of the political system, and the major one was questions of budget and taxation were supposed to go through the House of Commons. And this is the main reason that whether or not Charles was within sort of legal bounds by doing without Parliament was questionable. But keep in mind, like his father, he thought he was a divine right king above the law, who could do whatever he wanted. Members of Parliament, who were often lawyers, said, no way. Right? We've had the recognized right for a couple hundred years before this to make all decisions that have to do with budget, finance, taxation. And if he's ruling for 11 years without them, of course, he's having to make decisions about budget, finance, and taxation. So thorough happened after sort of he'd been having to find clever ways to bring in revenue to pay for government without Parliament, who are the experts at it, who have the institutional apparatus to do so. But once they kind of run out of creative ways to do so, thorough was instituted. And it was sort of what it says. It was an attempt not to find new ways to collect, new types of revenue to collect, like new taxes that they could sort of enforce on the public, which they'd already been doing. But this was to make tax collection more thorough. How do you do that? Well, you can kind of see where this is going. Wentworth, or Strafford, as he was called, his title, said at one point, sometimes a little violence is necessary. That's what basically thorough meant. In those days, it was hard to keep track of taxes, and didn't have computers, no IRS. So a lot of the money that was supposed to get back to the public coffers and the treasury didn't make it, because people were pocketing it along the lines. So what Strafford was in charge of is cracking down on this, finding those who are taking the money and stuffing it in their pockets, and crack their skulls and take their money and say, thank you, you're in prison. So this was pretty brutal, even though the people were usually kind of cheating the government by holding on to tax revenue. William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was in charge of the religious part of Thorough, which wasn't about taxation. It was about sort of making religious policy more thorough. Charles I imposed a new Book of Common Prayer, which was an Anglican church specialty, meaning other Christian countries, churches didn't have a Book of Common Prayer. So this was kind of uh, an adjunct to the Bible that only was used in England. That was written for the Church of England when it was first created under Elizabeth's reign. Uh, and uh, Charles, the king, ordered Laud to enforce this on the Scots, because he was still king of Scotland as well. But the Scots were already staunch Presbyterians and wanted no part of the Church of England, which they actually saw as closer to Catholicism compared to sort of their position, in religious belief and practice. And when Charles then did impose, I mean, this is one of the examples of Charles not listening to anybody. This made no sense at all because there was going to be a gigantic backlash just because you're imposing basically a prayer book on them that they don't use and they don't want to use. They don't see it as legitimate. Why? Uh, because he's trying to do what Louis XIV was doing, impose uniformity religiously on everybody the rules, but doing so callously, and awkwardly, to put it mildly. And sure enough, when this came down in Scotland, the Scots were so enraged that they raised an army and invaded the north of England in 1640 and actually occupied some of the northern counties of England. And this is a disaster for Charles I in the making, because he had done without Parliament for better than 10 years, and now he's already struggling. Thorough shows it, to find new ways to bring in money, or make sure we get all the money that's due to us. And now he's got to raise an army to get the Scots out of northern England, and he had to. There's no way a king of England could allow, in the eyes of the English people, the Scots to occupy part of your kingdom. What kind of an English king are you? How weak could you possibly be? So he had to pull out all stops to drive them out of northern England. But wars cost money, and he'd already reached his limit. So what did he need to do? Have to do? You guessed it. He had no choice but to call Parliament back into session. So these guys who had bided their time, some of them had died and retired, but now they're replacements through elections. Now they understand the institution, they know what's been going on, and now they can't wait to come back. Because he calls them back and he tells them, I need the money and I need you guys to approve it because you're the experts at doing so. You can come up with it more quickly, more easily than I can. I need your help. What did they say? Students often say that he said no. Come on. These are politicians we're talking about. Politicians aren't going to say no in a situation like that because they have Charles over a barrel here. So what they're going to say is yes, but yes, if. We'll give you the money if you agree to this, 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 this. We have a whole laundry list of grievances against you. We're going to change the way governing is done here and in the future. And if you want the money, you're going to sign on the dotted line that you agree. And of course he did sign. He had no choice. And he got the funds to drive the Scots out of North England. And he did. And then he turned around and rescinded his word, went back on his word for not the first time. I'm skipping a lot of steps here. And so one more time, he double-crossed Parliament and was not true to his word. Things started to continue to spiral out of control. Parliament, which now dedicated itself to staying in session, became known as the Long Parliament, actually, which makes sense. They were out for 11 years. Now they're not leaving. But they start issuing all kinds of declarations, and one of them was the Grand Remonstrance. A remonstrance is kind of a warning, and saying if you keep doing this, there's going to be further problems. So in 1641 comes again. There had been many other petitions and documents issued by them trying to sort of claim their legal authority to rein the king in and make him listen to reason, and he kept defying them again and again and again. So this is one of the last straws. England was moving towards civil war, and it became increasingly apparent to anyone paying attention that it was. And sure enough, and again, I'm skipping some steps, in 1642, when nothing could be reconciled because they couldn't get Charles to compromise at all. And so a war began. The king's army became known as the Cavaliers. We still kind of use that word even today. Basketball team with that name. That used to be an NBA team when they had LeBron. Little NBA joke there. And the Roundheads, not as glorious a name, the name for the Parliamentary Army. So yes, that sounds strange, but the king had an army, and Parliament raised an army. And they duked it out on battlefields across England, a bloody civil war over a number of years, about 5 or so, about who gets to call the shots, the king or mainly the House of Commons and Parliament. And this was to be decided by a bloodshed now, and not by political maneuvering. That was already tried and didn't work. You'd think, okay, a king is going to win a war because he's already got an army or can get one quickly. These guys from Parliament, they're not used to fighting. Who's going to lead their armies? Actually, members of Parliament, not completely, but much of it. The guy who quickly rose to the top was a Puritan, basically means Protestant Calvinist, kind of like the Huguenot in France. And there were far more of them in England than there were in France. And keep in mind, England is okay with Protestants, although the Puritans are pretty extreme Protestants. But Cromwell was from a wealthy, non-noble family, gentry class, basically kind of the capitalist class we talked about in France, and was a lawyer, member of Parliament, elected member of the House of Commons. And when the war broke out, he quickly became a leader and led troops in battle. But most importantly, what he did, as he was kind of rising through the ranks, getting promoted, was to reorganize the Parliament army based on principles that were being laid down in other parts of Europe, Sweden, the Netherlands, by military thinkers, intellectuals in those places. So he didn't come up with these ideas, but he implemented them for the first time in England. The King's Army did nothing of the sort. They should have, but it sounds, again, very basic to us. But remember, right, the things that seem obvious to us now weren't always obvious. We're on the other side of them, so it seems easier than it probably was. Organization, efficiency, drill. Right? Modern armies are still based on these things and more, but the idea is that we have to be a more efficient army. We have to train our troops. We have to train them to fight in formation and to fight together as units, unit cohesion, and have them practice again and again and again to get better and better at discharging their weapons, at riding their horses in formation or marching in formation, and this paid off. And it's one of the reasons that the Parliament's army eventually defeated Charles I, and forced him into a surrender. Actually, was captured at the Battle of Naseby, and they didn't even put him under armed guard. And he claimed, if you okay, I'll negotiate with you now. Like, what do you mean? You just lost a war. You refused to negotiate with us. We had to go to war. We've defeated you, and now you're telling you will negotiate with us? You'll sit there and listen and shut up. You'd think that's what they would say, but they didn't. They actually agreed to negotiate with the guy and didn't have him under armed guard. And what did he do? He escaped. So bad faith, goes against his word yet one more time. And he actually went out and tried to raise a new army, partly in Scotland, which was a joke because they hated him. And so there was kind of a brief second civil war, but it barely got off the ground before he was finally, just out of gas. And he was captured and he finally was imprisoned. Cromwell had risen to the top of the Parliament's military, which now is becoming England's military because they just won the war. So now they're going to make the decisions. And Cromwell sent a colonel named Pride, which is his last name, into Parliament in 1648, known as Pride's Purge. And he, kind of at gunpoint or sword point, sort of thinned out the House of Commons. Basically, anybody that had been loyal to the king, and there were some in Parliament, was told to go home, sent packing. So what was left was what became known as the Rump Parliament, meaning a rump, like a rump roast, is a small, of small roast. So this is a smaller rump parliament now because a lot of its members have been expelled. Anybody that wasn't loyal to parliament, a lot of the king, is gone. This shows us something too. It says at the bottom of the screen in parentheses, there was no notion anywhere in Europe yet. This is a very new idea of legitimate opposition. What does that mean? Well, where you have political parties, and even the ones that aren't in power at the time, that don't have the king or the president or whatever, they're still considered legitimate. Right? You might disagree with them. You don't like their ideas. They're the minority party, but they're not like sent home, or they're not arrested and killed for treason. So there wasn't this notion of we can have legitimate political disagreements peacefully, all as part of government. No. They sent the other guys, the losers, packing. I mean, they lost, not losers in the way usually we use the term today, which I don't like. To kill a king. The trial and execution of Charles I. Yep, it went that far. Cromwell was kind of at the head of the line, saying this guy has to go. Charles defended himself at his trial. Actually, did it very well, though the decision right was probably a foregone conclusion. Although it was close, and he was eventually convicted of treason and sentenced to death. But there were plenty of people involved, even in the Rump Parliament. And these are the hand-picked parliamentary loyalists, not the king's buddies. And even they were somewhat split on putting this guy to death. How could that possibly be? Right? Most of them hated this guy. All of them might have hated him. Why? Well, putting a king to death is pretty serious business. Regicide, as it's called. This, is a situation of enormous gravity, and they knew it. That it's an uncomfortable precedent to set, even if you hate the king, even if he's violated every law and every, sort of rule of good behavior, and right, there's no reason to follow this guy any longer. Killing him is for many people kind of a bridge too far. They barely got enough to convict him or to put him to death after convicting him, but they did. He went to the scaffold in 1649, January, beginning of that year, saying in his last words, apparently, I am a martyr for the people. Seeing himself as sort of, he's the guy that's sort of defending the people, which is quite a stretch, but it's the way he saw it. There were apparently gasps of onlookers. Public executions were just that, they were public. So the public, there'd be crowds. It was a spectator sport. And you can see in the upper right a drawing. How did important people get executed? With an axe, right? Their head on the block and their head chopped off, which is what happened to Charles just after he apparently said, I'm a martyr for the people. People that weren't powerful, just average people, were hung if they were executed. And I'm not kidding. If you thought you were an important person and you got convicted and sentenced to death, and you found out they were going to hang you, you would have thrown a fit, and you would have complained and said, no, you have to chop my head off. I'm not joking. Right? It was a matter of status. Only dirtbags get hung. Important people get their heads chopped off. I got to be remembered as an important person. Chop my head off. That's serious. I know it's funny, but it is serious. So what happens next? Not only did Parliament, now the Rump Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, the former Puritan lawyer, member of the House of Commons, turned general, organized the new model army, but he had risen to the top now and was in a position, really, in a sense, kind of take over. But they didn't just stop short of convicting a king of treason and executing him. The Rump Parliament, again at Cromwell's behest with his lead, they abolished the monarchy. What? Right? The 100 years long government of England is now gone. What do they replace it with? Good point. This is something we should think carefully about today. When we want to, radically change our government, okay, but what do you have to replace it with? We'll think of that when we get there. Maybe you better think again about that. So They didn't really have a whole lot of ideas for what to do without a king, without a monarchy. And so this kind of, without pre-planning, and devolved or evolved into kind of a military dictatorship light, or somewhat of a republic, but kind of with military leadership. Cromwell, as a military man, had divided England into military districts and had governors, military governors in each district. So if it was a military dictatorship, it was kind of on the light side, not a harsh one. It might have been something even less than that, but Oliver Cromwell really became more or less a kind of a benign dictator, and took the title Lord Protector, which is very modest of him. At least he didn't call himself the king, but I'm the Lord Protector of England. Professor Perry, our beloved textbook author, says in the context of the 1650s, the decade in which he ruled, there's no monarchy. This is known as the Interregnum, by the way. Sorry, at the very top. And it's kind of a word that means intermission. This is an intermission between monarchies. So a 10-year intermission, interregnum, with a military dictator or, Lord Protector as leader, not the king. So Cromwell was a moderate Republican who also believed in limited religious toleration for Protestants, although he was a Protestant. Yet history has painted him somewhat unjustly as a military dictator. So there's still some question about this. He says somewhat unjustly, not entirely. So there's still question about what we're to make of Cromwell's period, which I think also tells us that they didn't really know what they were doing. We abolished the monarchy, okay, but what are you putting in its place? Again, I'm saying we don't totally know. This was good times for the Puritans. Cromwell was a staunch Puritan. The Puritans have been a minority, like the Huguenots have been in France, but now this is their heyday. They get lots of laws put on the books that are in step and in sync with their beliefs, not just religious, but there were laws against, like, drinking. Uh, you can see how popular Cromwell's rule became quickly. Right? If you've been to England before, and I'm not criticizing the English, I love the country, but they kind of like their ale. They've got like a pub on every corner practically, and Cromwell, as a Puritan, comes along and sort of tries to kind of crack down on some of these things. Not popular, but the Puritans loved it. The Scots and the Irish, not so much. He invaded those two countries and sort of violently brought them to heel. In fact, it's really from Cromwell's time on that the English start to have a increasingly terrible relationship with the Irish, who were under their control, and that's the problem. They dominated the Irish, pushed them aside, and abused them, oppressed them from this point forward for centuries. But it kind of started with Cromwell. So you can argue about whether he was good for England and a good guy or not. Maybe more on the not side. Well, when Cromwell died, you think, okay, well, they don't. What are they going to do now? Cromwell had planned to have his son, Richard Cromwell, sort of take over for him. So he's trying to establish kind of the Lord Protector as a hereditary position. But Richard Cromwell was no Oliver Cromwell. I mean, he didn't have the stature and the ability and maybe the willpower of his father, and so he wasn't able to hold on to it. And the movers and shakers in England, the dukes and the wealthy merchant families, gentry class, got together and just said, we're going to shove Richard Cromwell aside. The experiment without the monarchy didn't really work very well. Certainly, it wasn't any better than the monarchy, before they abolished it. And this again shows how few ideas they had about what to do, how to govern, what kind of structure for this. They put the monarchy back into place. The Restoration, 1660, they restored the monarchy. So they shoved Richard Cromwell aside and said, we're not listening to you. And he didn't have the ability, the power to fight against them. And they put the monarchy back in place. Not only that, who did they make king? Yes, you got it right again. Charles II, the son of Charles I, the guy whose head they chopped off about a decade before. They invite his son to be king. He had been living under the protection of none other than Louis XIV in France. Why? Well, partly because Louis, didn't want to have to be allied with regicide, bad precedent for another king to set. but also Charles II was a secret Catholic. And so Louis XIV liked that part of it because he saw putting this, helping to put this guy back in power, which he kind of did by protecting him, as sort of a way to possibly get Catholicism sort of back into through the back door in England, to bring it back to England. So Louis XIV was scheming. So that wasn't necessarily Charles II's plan. He did sign a secret treaty with Louis XIV that, when it became known in the middle of his kingship, certainly caused lots of controversy because by that time the English basically hated Catholics, hated them, and always sort of believed in conspiracy theories about the Pope and the Catholic Church and Louis XIV, the Catholic King, etc., etc. Charles II had all the flaws of the other Stuarts, the previous Stuarts. Bad political judgment, pissed everybody off. He had a good personality. He was funny, had a good sense of humor, but was quite lazy. Didn't work hard. Again, a good example to put up there as sort of the opposite of Louis XIV, who was a workaholic. Colbert, his assistant, workaholic. This guy, lazy, sort of didn't, was spoiled as the son of a king. You'd think he would do a better job since he already saw firsthand what happens to kings in England. Apparently, when they don't do a good job, they lose their heads. And it was your father, even. And you'd also think that he would be more careful in not angering Parliament and trying, going overboard to try to please them and do what they want to do, for fear that he's going to lose his own head. And he didn't. He went in the other direction and sort of pushed the idea that I'm an absolute king. Maybe not as harshly as his father had, but you'd think dangerously. Dude, are you crazy? You're going to end up just like your dad. But he's smarter than that sounds. I think he understood something that not that many seem to see, and it was true. He understood he could go the other direction precisely because his father had lost his head. That the English as a whole, as a people, average people, nobility, basically, most of the population was at this point, after the fact, horrified, remembering that they had killed their own king. As much as they hated Charles I, that hadn't changed. Nobody liked the guy's memory at all, but they were now horrified at what they had done. And Charles II knew this. So the last thing they wanted was another civil war. And so because he knew they didn't want a civil war, I can get away with anything. They're going to do whatever they can to try to please me, not vice versa, because the last thing they want to do is have to take another king down, execute him, and have another civil war. So this is why he was able to push things. It was actually pretty shrewd. It was still a gamble, but it was shrewd. In the middle of Charles's reign, his younger brother, James Stuart, who was the Duke of York, which is a post, or a title, I should say, that the king's brother always sort of gets in England. Duke of York. He was a military hero in England, a naval admiral in the Royal Navy, and he'd fought, as a gifted leader. But unlike his older brother, who was the king, James Stuart was also a Catholic, but wasn't content to be a secret Catholic. He came out as an open Catholic in a country that, as we know, is increasingly hateful towards Catholics and Catholicism in general. Hates the Catholic Church. And now the brother of the king comes out openly Catholic. Not a good idea. And so this just stirred up a hornet's nest of controversy. This actually was so controversial, it was the beginning of the two-party system in England. Right? We've kind of emulated that structure in this country, the next century. The Tories, who supported the monarchy, more or less, not always out of love, the Stuart monarchy, that is, and the Whigs, who were sort of the party in opposition to the monarchy. But there was a specific issue which brought this about, relating to James Stuart's Catholicism, and that was that about half of Parliament wanted to pass a law, and tried to, prohibiting James from being able to take the throne once his brother died and passed away, because he was the next person in the line of succession unless his brother had a male heir, which he didn't have at the time. So the half of the Parliament was terrified that this guy would become king because he was next in line. So they tried to pass what was called the Exclusion Bill or Exclusion Act, which went through the House of Commons 3 times, and it failed all 3 times, but it was very close. And on the side, became the Whigs, who were trying to make sure that James never became king by passing a law prohibiting it, was a guy named Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury. You see here, he was sort of a big Whig politician, leader of this new party called the Whigs. These are the first 2 parties in English history, and this guy's leading the charge, trying to get James Stuart, banned from being king. Shaftesbury today is most famous for having a secretary working for him named John Locke. John Locke worked for him, so Locke was involved in this process as well. So half of the parliament defended the Stuarts and James' right to become king once his older brother Charles II died. Not out of love for them. There were a few members of parliament that openly supported the Stuarts because they were the Stuarts, but more of them just supported it for reasons we already know, or defended, against the Exclusion Act, not because they loved James Stuart or the Stuarts at all, but because they feared the chaos. They feared that another civil war would break out. We have to maintain stability, so unfortunately, we're going to have to support, even as odious a character as the Catholic James Stuart becoming king. So they did so reluctantly, but they thought it was best for England's stability and political social system going forward. But this was an earthquake of a political contest, right? So propaganda posters, all kinds of stuff went, and also conspiracy theories. All kinds of conspiracy theories abounded. Stories about the Pope has sent assassins into England, along with Louis XIV. They've paid assassins to come in and assassinate Charles II so that his brother, the Catholic king, can become king next. Not knowing that secretly the older brother, who was already king, was either a Catholic or at least had Catholic sympathies. It's not entirely clear if he was already baptized or not. I'm not. Maybe they know, and I don't know. So sure enough, James II does become king. The exclusion bills, all 3 had failed, so they failed to legally prohibit him. And his older brother died a natural death, although he'd pissed everybody off as well, without a male heir. And so next in line was the next oldest brother, and James, Duke of York, becomes James II, and 1685. And he reigned from 1685 to 1688, 3 years, which tells you how popular he was. And to say that he was the least popular of the Stuart kings is saying something indeed. This guy was hated, and we already know at least some of the reasons why, but he made the same errors. That is, I don't know if this was genetic or learned or just a coincidence, but he had the same habit of being able to easily anger and get on the wrong side of just about anyone and everyone, particularly Parliament, right? The major obstacle institutionally and politically to absolute power. So all these guys, one Stuart after another, are getting in their own way. They can't get out of their own way, apparently. So his sins against England, well, number one, he's a Catholic. But they were, and again, he wasn't really cooperating with the Parliament, and all the same problems that we've come to now probably hate because I've repeated them again and again. Sorry, that's what they're doing again and again. But they were tolerating him, hoping that okay, we'll just get through his reign. Eventually, he'll grow old and die, and then get back to sort of normal. What happened? Well, he married as a Catholic. He married a Catholic princess from, I forget if it was Spain or Italy, one of the two, and finally did the unpardonable. Right, the final straw. Yes, his wife had a baby. Right, and all kinds of conspiracy theories abounded here as well. The favorite one, and my favorite one, was the story of the warming pan baby. The rumor, wasn't true, of course, but the rumor was that they didn't even really have a kid. This was just a way to try to get England to be not just a temporarily Catholic country, the temporarily Catholic king, but to make it a permanently Catholic country. So they stole some, poor peasant woman's young baby or little baby, and took it into the palace under a warming pan, like bringing food, like biscuits or whatever, under a pan with like a cloth over it, and it's a baby that they sneak in. Oh, the queen just had a baby, and it's baptized as a Catholic, and now we've got the heir. That's James I, his son, who's a Catholic as well. And so this was the final straw, because again they were tolerating him because there's going to be one Catholic king, and then we'll go back to Protestantism. But that's not the case now that the queen, and she did have her own child, and it was baptized. So now everybody realizes, if this happens, then what's likely to happen is England will go back gradually to being an officially Catholic country. Remember, the majority of the population hated Catholicism by now. And so this was considered just utterly unacceptable. And so they looked around for a replacement, meaning the movers and shakers. There was a handful of noblemen. I think it was the Immortal Seven, they're called. 7 guys that kind of conspired together behind James's back, and tried to figure out, how do we get rid of this guy? What are we going to do? Well, they weren't going to find a replacement, but they realized that the replacement has to have sort of 3 qualities at the least, right? And it's like, how are you going to find somebody ready at hand that has these 3 qualities? You have to have somebody that has military muscle, who can take the throne from the King of England and make it his own throne. That's a tall order already. Second, he's got to be a Protestant. Okay, well, half Europe, isn't Protestant, and he's got to be, legitimizable. You've got to be able to make him legitimate. Where are you going to find a guy like that? He has to be legitimate. He's got to be a Protestant. He's got to have an army, a powerful one. That's no problem. Just go across the English Channel to the Netherlands, and and ask William of Orange, the Dutch leader of the Dutch Republic, not a monarch, but the guy's in power, legally in power. He'd been fighting Louis XIV with his army successfully, at least holding his own against Louis XIV. So he had military muscle. He was Protestant, and he was a Stuart in-law. He was married to their sister. Perfect. He's not a blood Stuart, but he'll be married to a blood Stuart who will be the queen. We can legitimize that easily. This guy was perfect, and he's close by, just across the English Channel in Holland. So they secretly invited him to come over, bring his army with him, land in France, and duke it out with James II, which he obliged and did. And this, known as the Glorious Revolution, kind of the second revolution in this century, after the Civil War being the first, partly called the Glorious Revolution because it was bloodless, or relatively so, but also glorious because it changed English history. How was it bloodless, by the way? Right? He's going to have to fight the King of England's army. We'll get back to that. But this marks, once it was sort of all said and done, and William of Orange becomes William III, the next King of England, which he did. This is the moment where you can sort of mark England as having finally become a constitutional monarchy. As Professor Perry says, the Revolution's settlement of 1688 and 9 resolved the profound constitutional and social tensions of the 17th century and laid the foundations of the English government that exists today. The year 1688 saw the creation of a new public and political order that would become the envy of enlightened reformers. England becomes the constitutional monarchy, or a constitutional monarchy, but also the constitutional monarchy because it was kind of the model everyone wanted to emulate, because it was so solid and successful from this point forward, and more so as time went on. So how did he make this happen, though? How did they pull this off? Well, when James I was faced with a challenge, William's troops landed in the south of England. What did he do? Well, he did what any proud English king would do. He ran away. It was Monty Python. Run away. Right? What do you mean run away? Well, as I say it, to simplify, he could count. What do you mean? He could count how many people support him. 1, 2, 4, I'm out of here. Right? He was so unpopular, he knew he wasn't going to win. What he really was counting was how many loyal officers and soldiers do I have in the military? 4? Okay, I'm out of here. It was a wise move. He was going to lose and probably would have lost his life. Although he does try to make a comeback, and so do some of his successors. He lived in France as well, in exile, and his relatives, him at first, and then his relatives tried to make a comeback. Ever heard of Bonnie Prince Charlie? He is a successor, a grandson of James II, who tried to make a comeback and raise a military force and fight his way back onto the throne of England, and he failed. And his father tried to do it before him. So the Stuarts don't go away easily, but they're never kings again. William III is a Protestant, and now they finally have a king that is smart enough and I think humane enough, reasonable enough, who agrees to rule under law, agrees to rule with limits, agrees to the Parliament has certain rights, which you see laid out there. There was a Bill of Rights that he had to agree to, and he did. And he still had power, don't get me wrong. He immediately took England into the 9 Years' War, as it became known, or King William's War, named after him, against Louis XIV. He is already fighting them with his Dutch army. Okay, now he's going to add the English armies, which he controls anyway. So he still had lots of clout, but he still ruled alongside Parliament legitimately and made sure things were done through law with Parliament's agreement. And so now England is a legitimate constitutional monarchy. I want to deal with one more thing, and this can take a few minutes here, pardon me, but to show us how solid a political and economic system England was able to establish through this whole century of turmoil and crisis on the other end of it, I want to look at something that one historian, a current historian, calls the Square of Power. And this kind of revolves around the creation of the Bank of England, you see in the lower left of our Square of Power, which was created in 1694, just a number of years after William takes the throne, and in the middle of King William's War. And of course, there's a connection. Wars are expensive, and the Bank of England was created in part to make it easier to pay for warfare, particularly that war, but it stayed and became sort of the most effective way that any country had come up with yet to pay for war. This is a major reason, not the only, but a major reason why, as I've already said, the English, or the British as they become known soon enough, go on to become the most wealthy and powerful country in Europe. They could beat you in war because they could spend more, they could pay for more, they could raise the money more quickly than anybody else. Again and again and again, they proved it. So what do? Well, they made sure that they used modern, bureaucratic techniques and organizational efficiency to collect taxes effectively, and so that everybody knew, okay, this government can they can tax, they can get what they that they demand out of the public in a way that we hadn't seen earlier in the century. They're able to sort of do it now. The excise tax was the most famous one, and there was a whole bureaucracy of civil servants that worked for the excise department, and they became known for being good at their jobs. So, okay, why is that important? Well, to raise money the way they wanted to, they're going to have to prove that they're solid, that they have money coming in. And Parliament was kind of the watchdog agency. They were there to make sure this whole Square of Power worked and was relatively uncorrupt and efficient. And so they sort of were the overseers of all this. The Bank of England, what did it do? Well, that connects to the national debt, our last of the four corners in our Square of Power. National debt is another way of saying bonds. England was proposing, wasn't a brand new idea, but they were the first ones to implement it on a large scale and successfully, very successfully. The idea was we're going to pay for warfare, not just through taxes, but also through bonds, right? Loans. Bonds are loans to the public, right? That's true today. When we talk about our debt and deficit, I never can figure out why the media doesn't tell us this, doesn't tell you this. When they talk about the debt and the deficit, that's soaring numbers always. What they don't tell you is that those are bonds held mostly by Americans. Some of it's foreign owned. The Chinese own a large chunk of our bonds today, but most of it are American investors that buy bonds as an investment opportunity. But they're, as an investment opportunity, what they're doing is loaning money to the government, and they get a certificate back, the bond, which says we're going to pay, the government will pay you back plus interest. That's why you have a desire to do this, because you make a profit. It's in your self-interest to get the interest. It's a way to make money. It's an investment. This is brilliant, because this way you don't have to ask someone to loan money to the government. They'll come, and they do. In our country, they do now, and they did in England. We copied their system. Alexander Hamilton does that later on, but because it's profitable. And if the government is known to be able to collect taxes efficiently, as we already know they're doing now, and Parliament watches over the whole process and makes sure it is happening efficiently, and everybody knows that the government is solid, they collect taxes effectively, right? And the Bank of England is in place. Then investors, potential investors, are more likely to say, you know what, this is a good deal. This government collects taxes effectively and pays back on time, all the time, pays off the interest, whatever the term of the bond is. They're good. I'm buying in. This is a great investment. I'll make money, and it's almost a sure thing because they're so solid. So the one corner we don't have yet is what is the Bank of England's role in all this? Well, it's a government bank, partially government, partially privately owned, which is the way the U.S. one, emulated by Alexander Hamilton, comes out as well the next century. But the main thing to remember here, those sort of other functions, is this made the whole process of paying for a war even easier and quicker. Remember, this whole thing is about war, at least at first. After it's in place into the next century and beyond, it starts effectively paying for other things as well. But at this point, it's war. So how does this help? Well, selling bonds, right? It's attractive for the reasons we just mentioned, but it still takes a while to sell the bonds off to everybody. It's individual investors. You got to get a bunch of them together, and that takes some time, and it can be kind of inefficient. So if you have a Bank of England that's got like rich people stuffing their money in it, and it's got investors in the bank that are rich people as well, and it's hemorrhaging cash, when Parliament, the king, decide they need to go to war, and they need to say $50 billion, wouldn't have been that much then, but if they need $50 billion, instead of marketing the bonds over weeks and months, they just go outside, go next door to the Bank of England, not that it was next door, knock on the door and say, hey, could you write us out a check for $50 billion? Okay, sure. And from that second on, the government can start paying the troops and start paying for weapons and supplies and getting them together and going to war. And the Bank of England can now take its own sweet time in marketing and selling the bonds to the investors. So the Bank of England just sort of cuts one of the steps out and just allows the money to go straight to the government, and the bonds will be sold afterwards. The government can fight its war. The Bank of England can now take care of the, getting its sort of money, the $50 billion back by getting investors to willingly, come forward and buy bonds. So this square of power was a brilliant mechanism for paying for war and eventually paying for other things. And again, it's a major reason why the government of England, the country of England, was extremely powerful and extremely wealthy from about 1750 on.